everyone, and welcome to this Care Experience and Culture event. And a particular welcome to Susan Francis here in Australia and Anne Harrison over in the UK, who have come along today to talk about their fantastic memoirs. My name is Dee Michelle and I'm located on Kaurna land in South Australia. I'm an academic at the University of Adelaide and delighted to have been working with Rosie Canning, who's in England for the past 18 months or so on our project, Care Experience and Culture. Rosie and I met online in 2018 and in person at the fabulous Care Experience conference held at Liverpool Hope University in April 2019, and I've barely travelled since. We discovered a mutual interest in the representation of care experience people and a mutual source of inspiration in Lem Sisse, whose work encouraged Rosie to do a PhD and me to do a blog showing that real life care experience people can often be every bit as amazing as popular fictional characters like Anne of Green Gables, who is one of my childhood favourites. In November 2020, we applied to the Welland Trust in the UK for some funding to put together a digital archive of literature, films, television shows, etc., which feature care experience people, as well as writers, actors, performers who are care experienced themselves. Our aim for the project is to contribute toward changing community attitudes about care experience people as a group. Although there are occasional success stories in the media about care experienced people, in the main, a single story is told, and that story is about how we are overrepresented in the prison, mental ill health and homelessness populations. Instead of only being seen through that current single lens, which is an indictment on state care systems everywhere, we do want us to be recognised as a creative group despite and even because of often experiencing hardship and trauma. Rosie and I launched the Care Experience and Culture Digital Archive during the inaugural Care Experience History Month in April last year, thanks in large measure not only to the funding from the Welland Trust, but also to the invaluable help of Jamie Crabb, who is an accredited therapist based in North London, as well as a writer and something of a whiz when it comes to advising on how to design and set up a web page. Rosie and I were delighted that Dr. Kirsty Capes came along to the launch to talk about her debut novel, Care Less, which forms part of her creative writing PhD. For Kirsty, writing Care Less was a cathartic experience, even though the story is fictional. The protagonist is a 15-year-old girl living in foster care, and the story, while highlighting many of the difficulties of living in the care system, including internalising external messages of inevitable failure, is also hopeful and aspirational. Award-winning activist and agitator Kenny Murray also came along and talked to us about his work in calling out negative media portrayals of people who are care experienced. Too often, he said, we're used as a lazy shorthand for troubled or dangerous. And he highlighted some prominent television shows like the American series You on Netflix, which features a care experienced person as a stalker, and an earlier British show, The Fall, which has care experienced Paul Spector as a serial killer. Me, Rosie, Jamie Crabb, Kirsty Capes, Kenny Murray, all of us care experienced, all of us university educated. Therefore, just by being out and proud as care experienced people, we are disrupting stereotypes. For good reason, lots of people in the past have not talked about being raised in out-of-home care, as we call it in Australia. For example, the father of Australian art history, Bernard Smith, didn't talk about being in foster care until after he retired from his job as an academic. Or people don't know this aspect of a person's origin story, as I found out recently during the annual Marilyn Jetty Swim, where dozens of locals impersonate Marilyn Monroe at Brighton Beach in Adelaide as a fundraiser. Oh, I didn't know that about Marilyn, one of the lookalikes said after I told them that Marilyn Monroe was in foster care, orphanages and kinship care as a child. By the time she was 7, she'd been moved 7 times. Between the ages of 8 and 12, she'd been moved 6 times. On social media, I often see a picture of Marilyn Monroe with jazz great Ella Fitzgerald. As the story goes, the most popular music venue in the 1950s, Macambo in Hollywood, wouldn't book Ella Fitzgerald because she didn't fit the glamour norms of the time. Monroe said if the club booked Fitzgerald for a week, she'd be in the front row with friends every night. Ella Fitzgerald was in kinship care and a reform school as an orphan teenager. Because she ran away from the New York State Training School for Girls and couldn't return to her aunt's house for fear of being caught and return to the training school, she was homeless for quite a while. According to American journalist Nina Bornstein, in 1996, Ella Fitzgerald kept secret for more than 60 years that year of being incarcerated in the training school. Perhaps she told Marilyn, who knows? But when that picture of the two women does the rounds on social media, as it does quite regularly, no one mentions that Marilyn Monroe and Ella Fitzgerald were both in out-of-home care as children. Today, we have two more fabulous women here to talk with us and subvert some stereotypes. Anne Harrison was brought up in the UK care system and joined the Warwickshire Police as a young adult and later qualified as a social worker. As you'll hear, Anne might have come to Australia as a small child and therefore have a different accent tonight, but our shameful racism was a factor in her remaining in England. Susan Francis was born in Australia and privately adopted as a baby. She grew up in Newcastle in New South Wales, has worked in publishing and as a high school teacher, and she has a master's degree in Australian literature. Before we hand over to Anne and Susan though, Rosie Canning, who is doing a creative writing PhD through Southampton University, is going to talk with us about the history of autobiography and memoir with particular reference to care experience. Thanks, Rosie.
Thank you very much, Dee. So I'm going to be talking about autobiography in the context of people who've had interrupted childhoods. So when I say interrupted, I just mean that the writer, when the writer was a child, there will have been a point at which they did not live with their parents for varying reasons: adoption, fostering, kinship care, incarceration, etc. Okay, so I'm going to start with Charles Dickens. He actually did write an autobiographical fragment in 1847, but it was never published by him. But it was included in The Life of Charles Dickens, written by John Forster, his close friend and advisor. Dickens, in fact, he was, such a good friend. Dickens appointed him as his literary executor. We've included Dickens in our archive because in 1822, when he was 10 years old, his father, John Dickens, was arrested and imprisoned for debt. His wife and three youngest children joined him at Marshalsea Prison, while Charles moved in with a family. This family ended up as the Garland family in his novel, The Old Curiosity Shop. In fact, many of the people he met ended up in his novels. As a way to help pay off his father's debt, Dickens was put to work in a blacking factory, which he hated. So that's why we've included him. I'm actually very interested, since I started the PhD, I became very interested in what I'd call the real working class, or as they're sometimes referred to, the underclass orphan voices, and whether or not they exist. So although Dickens was seen as middle class, his grandparents were in fact servants, but that is a whole other story. And I could literally take up the whole session today talking about Dickens. So after speaking with an archivist at Coram, I discovered that in the archives of the Foundling Museum, has everyone heard of the Foundling Museum? It's a really, really interesting place. And that's where Dee and I first met, wasn't it, Dee?
In person, absolutely. Yeah, that was fantastic.
Yeah. So I discovered in the archives of the Foundling Museum writings by real orphans born in the 18th and 19th centuries. Foundling children had a basic education and were taught to read and write, which is lucky for us. And it was also lucky for some of them. And it's really, really quite unusual. Professor Helen Berry, and you wrote Orphans of Empire, about some of the children raised at the Foundling Hospital, which was Thomas Coram's brainchild. It opened in 1741 and grew to become the most famous charity in Georgian England. Charles Dickens was so moved by his observation of the charity's work that he campaigned on behalf of orphans. So George King was admitted to the Foundling Hospital in 1787, and Berry includes some of his autobiographical writings. 1847 would have been when he finished writing them. It's the only surviving first-hand account written by a Foundling Hospital child born in the 18th century. And it gives insights into how he came to terms with his upbringing. Again, I could spend the whole time speaking about him. He's such an interesting character. Also in his autobiography, there is his part in Trafalgar. and how he saw Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson die on the 21st of October 1805. And it was actually his ship, George King, the ship that George King was on, that towed back Nelson's ship and dead body. Another foundling, Hannah Brown, was brought to the Foundling Hospital in 1866. She wrote an account of her childhood experiences, which was published in 1919 anonymously. She's quite negative about her time in the Foundling. And for when it was written, many of her observations are spot on. If you're reading the text on the screen, she says, and thus for a second time in 3 years, I was deprived of a mother, because foundlings used to be sent out to foster mothers. And a lot of the obviously young children got very attached, and then they would be snatched back by the Foundling Hospital and trained to be either servants or, sent off into the Navy. I think apprenticeships came a bit later. But anyway, she writes about the stigma. She calls it stigma, and how children's, and this is some of her words here, children's happiness and future welfare is sacrificed, even to the extent of their mother's name, nationality, thrown in the world without a relative or friend to confide in, and they have no right to the stigma attached to them. So when a baby was taken, they had to be under 12 months to be accepted by the Foundling. And when they went to the Foundling, they were made a note of in a book who the mother was. But then after that, they were given a new name and weren't told anything about their heritage or parents, or they were just given a little token. And if you have a look at the Foundling Museum and have a look at the tokens, they are absolutely heartbreaking. So here we have 3 well-known authors who've all written about autobiography. And these are famous writers who had interrupted childhoods, but were more financially privileged. Maybe not so much Anthony Trollope than George or Hannah. But Trollope and Gorky both attempted suicide when they were young. Trollope was 12, and I think, he was 12 as well at a young age. So it just shows that even though perhaps they had a bit more in material items and, had food and all the rest of it, they were no less happy. Continuing with less privileged children, I don't know if anyone's heard of Janet Hitchman's The King of the Barbarones. She was actually called Elsie May Fields. And at the age of 2.5 in 1919, Janet Hitchman heard the person she called Gran say sharply to someone, "She's no relative of mine, none whatever." And that was how she discovered that orphans were fed and clothed, but did not belong to anyone. And it was while at Barnardo she gave herself the name Janet, which she adopted from Jane Eyre, which is so interesting. I'm sure everybody's heard of Maya Angelou. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. When her parents' marriage, she calls it a calamitous, the marriage ended, their father sent her and the brother to Stamps, 3 and 4, on their own on the train, to live with their paternal grandmother. Angelou structures the book so that it presents a series of lessons about how to resist racism and oppression, and ends when Maya becomes a mother at the age of 16. Those of you that have read it know that there's a really, again, heartbreaking scene when she's raped by her mother's boyfriend, and she stops talking for many years. And it's not until an English teacher says to her, you've got to speak poetry in order to really feel it and understand it. And it was the English teacher that slowly helped her to start speaking again. And I didn't mention Leslie Thomas, so you might know him from The Virgin Soldiers. He was in Barnardo's. You also might not know that he actually wrote the popular Dangerous Davis, The Last Detective. I don't know if that's only on in the UK or if it's on in Australia as well, Dee.
I'm not familiar with him, but that doesn't mean to say it wasn't here.
Okay.
I'll look it up.
So what do these books have in common? Yes, as mentioned, the childhood that was interrupted, and that also involved trauma, separation, bereavement, abuse, and which often led to a miserable time. In 2002, Liz Berry in The Bookseller coined the phrase misery lit. It referred to the rise of inspirational memoirs or painful lives as labelled on the shelves in Waterstones. I think it can be taken as quite offensive. It's often used in a derogatory way. as though to demean the writing. Berry said that the genre seemed to come almost out of nowhere, and the consumer demand for these autobiographical stories is still popular today. However, the genre didn't quite come out of nowhere. Preceding and parallel to these tell-all tales, there had been a rise in the illness narrative that began after the Second World War in the 1950s, and which was attracting serious scholarship. You see the difference in the way that the things are written about, partly due to their explosion in numbers. Writers Dennis Potter in 1986 and John Updike in 1990 wrote about the skin disease psoriasis, which afflicted them both. It was also noted that traditionally autobiography had recorded the lives of the rich and famous, and suddenly was handed over to the ordinary person recording extraordinary events. There have been attempts to date the first misery memoir, and it led to journalists pinpointing titles as far back as Anthony Trollope's 1883 autobiography. However, Victoria Bates in Misery Loves Company in the Journal of Medical Humanities says, misery memoir must be studied in its own right and understood as a culturally specific genre of the 1990s onwards, and I would agree with that. According to many sources, it was Dave Peltzer's book, A Child Called It, 1995, closely followed by Angela's Ashes in 1996, that set the genre rolling. Peltzer writes of being brutally beaten. I couldn't get past the first page of A Child Called It, actually. But he writes of being brutally beaten and starved by his emotionally unstable alcoholic mother, a mother who played torturous, unpredictable games. Angela's Ashes won the Pulitzer Prize in 1997 and also the National Book Award, and topped best-selling lists in the US and the UK, as did Peltzer's. Court's memoir is a sad, funny, bittersweet memoir of growing up in New York in the 30s and in Ireland in the 40s. There's just a tiny little excerpt here. I'm not going to do the Irish accent. My mother and father should have stayed in New York, where they met and married and where I was born. Instead, they returned to Ireland when I was 4. My brother Malachi 3, the twins Oliver and Eugenie barely 1, and my sister Margaret dead and gone. When I look back on my childhood, I wonder how I survived at all. It was, of course, a miserable childhood. The happy childhood is hardly worth your while. Worse than the ordinary miserable childhood is the miserable Irish childhood, and worse yet is the miserable Irish Catholic childhood. It's a story of courage and survival against apparently overwhelming odds. I remember when I read it years and years ago, well, probably in 1996, I couldn't stop laughing the whole way through. I mean, it's really, really sad, and everything that, you know, his family went through, but he wrote it in such a way that it makes you laugh. And during 2004 and 2008, sales of memoirs in the US increased by 400%. Just to add, there have been many inspirational memoirs written before the 1990s, often by children who'd been in care. As previously mentioned, Janet Hitchman, Leslie Thomas, and many more. Bernardo's Quorum and other institutions have in their archives autobiographies that go into detail about time spent in these institutions going right back to the 19th century. And I hope to do more work around these voices once I finish the PhD. At the beginning of my PhD journey, I did wonder where the real orphan voices were, and that the orphan voices of my childhood were written and by the middle and upper class privileged writers. And therefore, as much as I enjoyed the adventures when I grew up, I noticed a lack of anything out there I could identify with for many, many years. Also, what my research has shown and is showing me is that those children writing are part of a social movement. These misery narratives are confessional in form, but they bear witness, sometimes angrily, to the failure of family life, the abuse of children both in and out of care, and wider societal failure. Misery Lit has put paid to any notion that the churches are good or that orphanages were safe places to be, and that the idea of only one sort of nuclear family being the ideal is slowly being eroded too. Lynn G. Farrell, and I can't remember the book that she wrote in a Miss Alexia article, this is what she says: Misery Lit forces us to face the realities of society. It builds our understanding, develops our empathy. It can teach us so much about abuse and illness, and crucially, about healing and coping. It also empowers voices that are all too often marginalised. We need a great many more of their stories, not less. And it's time to drop the misery label, just call it literature. And I agree with that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rosie. That's fantastic. What a collection. So should we hand over to Anne now to talk about her book called Call Me Aunty?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. My story, Call Me Aunty, is not just about my childhood in care. It's also about my search for my mother. And I've divided this story into 5 themes, and I'll just go through those 5 themes with you. So the first theme is abandonment. I was abandoned as a baby. My mum is actually from Barbados, and at 15, she got a scholarship to come to England to train as a nurse. She came back 1955, 1956. So she joined what is called the Windrush generation, where the British government were encouraging people from the Caribbean to come over here to fill jobs. So she started her training at Rugby St Cross Hospital, which is local to here. But soon after she was here, she became pregnant with me. After I was born, very shortly afterwards, she placed me with a private carer. But my mother fell behind with payments. And at 3 months, that private carer dumped me at the hospital where my mum was still training. So you can imagine the authorities, the hospital and the local authority actually went into overdrive as to what to do with this baby. And their solution was to place me in an orphanage. My mum then subsequently disappeared. So an advert went out, and the second part of my theme to my story is inclusion. This advert gets placed to look for a placement for me. And at 15 months of being in the orphanage, I was fostered by a white family. My new foster parents treated me like one of the family. Who were they? They were Dad Reed, who I refer to, worked at a local car factory, and Mum Reed, my foster mum, was a home carer. They also had 5 of their own children living in the same household. But in addition to that, they'd already fostered another black child. So the authorities, quite rightly, thought this would be a good fit, and a good fit it was for me. They were right. I was placed with them for a further 9 years. That was my home for 9 years. So part 3 is horror. My foster family, when I was 9, decided that they would emigrate to Australia. They joined the £10 POM migration scheme, so things like jobs, lifestyle, accommodation, and potentially the weather, would fit for them. Very key for them that they had improved jobs and lifestyle. I mean, I don't blame them for going, when they've got that face before them, but I couldn't go too. Firstly, I was the foster child. I wasn't their natural child. My mother would needed to have given permission anyway if I was to go, and she still was nowhere to be found. And also I was a black child, and to be going to Australia as a black child would be very, very detrimental. After that, because the authorities didn't actually know what to do with me, they placed me as what I can only describe as a horrible children's home. I now had to live in a large, depersonalised, Victorian-style, soulless institution with 23 other children with their various difficulties and needs, and a staff group that I can only describe as only caring about rules, routine, and control. So 4, as part of those themes, is confusion. I had a lot of confusion over my identity. From a small child to being a young adult, I had a lot of angst about being black. Being black for me was an unwelcome complication, and I wanted to be white. My beloved foster family was white, my friends, school, And of course, all the home staff at that stage was white. My world was full of white people. My skin, my hair made me very different to everybody else. Both my skin and my hair made it very hard to look after and for me to feel good and look good. I did not know any better, and nor did my carers. I had no way of actually finding out how to look about Black culture, and of course we didn't have Google then to actually check these things out. So, for instance, who knew that the fabulous Diana Ross and the Supremes, that their hair was wigs? I mean, I had no idea whatsoever. Or that makeup for white skin did not suit black skin. Believe me, I had to find out. Mystery. I spent years fantasizing about my mother, and as I've said, up until then, I had no idea where my mum was. But when I was 14, the authorities did actually find her. She also told them at that stage that I had a brother. Oh, what joy. At long last, I could think that I had family. But in her first letter to me, she told me that I was to call her auntie, hence the title of my book. And she avoided meeting with me for a further 20 years. So I've always had stories to tell about my life in care and beyond. And these stories were obviously based on my own memory and a few letters and photographs I've been able to keep from my various house moves along the way. And unlike children that live in families, I did not have older adults or siblings or family friends and neighbours to tell me how my life had actually been. And unlike most care leavers, I did not have my social services file when I left the children's home. I'd been told it had been destroyed. And I have tried over the years to write these memories down, but there were so many gaps. So what prompted me to get started writing? I had been told repeatedly that my care file had been destroyed, as I'd said earlier on. But when I was in my late 50s, I had a very, very unusual encounter with the police, which led me to ask for my social services file again. And lo and behold, 600 pages actually turned up. So my file arrived and it made me cry, and it made me very, very cross. I then spent considerable time going over the contents, putting the file in date order, querying all the redacted sections with social services, and poring over everything that had written about me. It was painful and enlightening in turns, but sometimes at the same time. But it filled in a lot of blanks, and I was finally able to put everything about my early life together. So that was really my motivation to get started. I had no experience of this type of writing, so I was very nervous when I started. My family gave me a lot of encouragement, and I was given reassurances by my brother, which meant a lot to me, to actually write my story. He also had a story to tell, but I now had the resource of my huge file. Anyway, I did begin to write, but I did not try to start at the beginning or to write in order. I began by writing incidents and episodes that came to mind, and it didn't matter at what stage of my life it occurred. I just wrote it down when I thought about it. And in some cases, my husband take me chattering away. Not that you could believe that I'd be chattering away. Or I used my voice memo, which was very strange. I kept a notebook in my bag or by my bed, and putting things in order came a lot later. But the writing was not always easy. The reality of what was written about me in my file would hit me hard at times. And I had to stop on many occasions because some of the memories were very painful. So some of these examples that was written. Number one, Anne is very attention seeking due to being spoilt by her foster parents. 2, we think owing to the colour of her skin, we will be unable to foster Anne out again, which is a pity as she's nice and normal child. And 3, Anne does not lie or have temper tantrums. But there are on occasions when drafting my book actually did make me smile, and here are some of the comments that made me laugh out loud. Anne is of a placid disposition and ready to smile. It's a good thing she's placid, or feathers would fly between her and her foster sister. 2, the teacher has had to move Anne's desk nearer to make her work. It has had the desired results. So I found excuses not to write as I was trying to be kind to myself, having read some of the comments in my book. But after I finished my draft, family, friends and close friends became my critics. And believe me, it wasn't always easy to hear their thoughts. I then had to swallow my pride and be prepared to reorganise my thoughts, rewrite and reorder paragraphs and chapters, and that took time. But not everything I needed to know was in the file. The thing I wanted to find out most was the identity of my alleged father. His name was written in a document, but it was redacted as third-party information. I did appeal, but I could get no further. The Data Protection Act was definitely against me, and I still do not know my father's name. So why did I write? I did write to actually find out more about who I am, and along the way I wanted to check my memory against facts, dates and observations of others in my file. But recalling your story is not always easy, but sometimes I astonish myself by the fact that my memory was correct. Some things then don't apply. This is not a misery story, and I didn't tell it or write it to feel or for anybody to feel my pain. And I avoid words like, did I find it traumatic or cathartic? No, when describing my book. This is not how I actually felt. I was just trying to solve the mystery of my early life and not to work through any pain. And I couldn't remain angry because you cannot stay in that state for long, and you must choose who you wish to be angry with. And this was more about it being my story, for that story to be finally properly told and better understood. But it has been full of mystery, a little bit of suspense and a bit of intrigue. But by the time I finished, I now thought I've got to know who I was. My Black identity does remain very important to me, but we all have different identities. And I did finally come to realise I'm not just defined by the colour of my skin. Sometimes white people do assume that because I'm Black, I can speak for all Black people and answer very general questions about being Black. I can only relate to my own and my family's experiences. But equally as important is that my care experience has shaped my life and significant career choices. I still do hospital corners on my bed, and I refuse to eat cold sausages. But eventually I did train in social work, and I became a social care manager and an inspector of care services. So getting published, all the work actually paid off, and I was lucky. I spoke to a friend who suggested a publisher with a focus on social care, rights, welfare and justice. I submitted the summary, sample chapter on the published website, and the publisher wrote to me the next day and asked for the full text. I was worried I had shared so much, and I was expecting negative comments, or to be told that my book was of no interest to others. A week later, the publisher offered me a contract. I was both elated, shocked, and a little bit overwhelmed, if the truth be told. I couldn't believe that this had actually happened. And it took a week from getting in touch to being told you will be published. And that is why I say I was lucky. So what's been the reception of me publishing my book? Well, comments have included, "You've been very brave to have been so brutally honest. I've known you since school days. I did not know. I would never have guessed that you were brought up like this. It was heartbreaking to read your book. Your book made me cry. Thank you for sharing your story. I too have a story to tell. I couldn't put it down. I had to read it in one sitting. Does your mother know you have written this book? And finally, I would have fostered you. So all very humbling and revealing comments, but it just reinforced that I was right to write my book. But if people did not like my book, I've not actually been told yet. So my book has now travelled everywhere and now been asked to do live talks. So is it a process I would recommend? Yes, it is. I was fortunate and 3 things were essential. Obviously, resources, motivation and luck. And with those resources, I now had my huge care file to work from, and my memories alone would not have made my book. So I had the motivation, and motivations for a lot of people do differ. Some want to unburden themselves, some people want to spill others' secrets. However, some people do have stories to tell, but they don't know where to begin. But I just wanted to know about my own story. And luck. I mean, I found the publisher right away, and that made me incredibly lucky. So here I am today, and I survived. So thank you for listening.
Fantastic, Anne. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. I'm wondering whether we'll go straight to Susan and then do questions afterwards for both Susan and Anne.
I think that's a good idea, yeah.
Okay, you up for that, Susan?
Yes, I'm up for that.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you again, Anne. That was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. That was really interesting.
So my name is Susan Francis. I'm speaking from Awabakal land in New South Wales, Australia. My book, The Love That Remains, came out in February 2020. It's a book about the search for identity, my identity, and it's a book about the search for love. So many things got in my way, I suppose, like Anne. I'm 61 in May. It took me until I was 55 years old to find out my history, my background, my story. Really a lifetime. The reason I wrote the book is because I was furious. I was furious that the Australian adoption system had decided that mothers who gave their children up for adoption, their rights were more important than the children who were given up for adoption. So up until 1993, it was impossible for me to find my own birth certificate. I was stuck with a birth certificate that was had my mother and father who adopted me. That was the name on my birth certificate. I had no idea who my mother or my father was, and I had no way of getting that information because it was illegal for me to access that birth certificate. And I found it really, really interesting to know that that book, The Child She Bare, the same circumstances, and we're talking 200 years difference, where you were not given any information about who you were, what your mother's name was. There was nothing given to you. You were just plunked into a new family and expected to take on the identity they gave you and never find out any different. So when I was, the numbers vary. Sometimes I've heard when I was 10 days old, sometimes I've heard when I was 3 weeks old. My mother and father couldn't have children because my father was infertile. They heard through my father's boss that there was a child going, that a doctor in Cardiff had a child, and that if they went and met the doctor and the doctor thought that they were all right, they could have the baby, which was me. So according to my mother, she rocked up at the GP's office on a Saturday morning, and literally the doctor just handed me over. So at that time, it was not done through any state services, or there were no checks or balances. I was really lucky because my mum and dad were great people. I had a very consistent childhood. However, my father had an affair when I was 3, and he left the family home. And my mother, obviously there was no single mother's pension. So he left, and she decided she had to go out to work because there was no other way of making any money. So I was to be put around the street. All the families in the street said that they would take turns looking after me. Then my father decided 6 months later that he would return, and my mother took him home because she said to me, 40 years later, I'd adopted you. How could I not let you grow up in a family? So she took Dad back. A year later, they decided they wanted to adopt another baby, but this time, because of what my father had done, and because this time it was done through the state, a woman or a man, I don't know, somebody in authority would have to turn up every week and interview Mum and interview Dad, and they would have to give the whole happy families thing so that they could adopt my brother. From then on, my mother and father were not happy. I didn't have a bad childhood, but they did not have a happy marriage. And I feel that being adopted and coming from that place of feeling that you were not lovable because your mother and father gave you up, and that's the feeling I've had my whole life. And people who are not adopted or who have not been in care, when I've said that, and it feels like a shameful thing for me to say, I say, I don't feel lovable. And it feels shameful, and I didn't say it very often in my life, but when I say it, people are really, really surprised. How can you not think that you are not lovable? How can you think that you're unlovable? But that's exactly how I felt my entire life. And I think on top of that was this layer of lack of affection in the home that I was adopted into. So there was no physical affection. My mother was a wonderful woman, but she did not give unconditional love. Her love was given conditionally. When I was about 7, I started what we used to call having accidents, and I was taken to a psychologist, and I would hear them talk about the fact that I was adopted, and did that have something to do with, why I was wetting my pants and why I couldn't sleep the night without wetting my bed. And through that, you can imagine that was really, really difficult. And my mother and father were really unhappy with me about that. Anyway, fast forward to when I'm 28. I have my own child, and my father is dying from cancer. And because I'd had some training in palliative care, I came back from where I was working because Mum decided she needed to keep working, and I would stay at home and look after my father in his last 3 months of his life. And interestingly enough, my father had been born illegitimately. So he had no idea who his father was, and he'd grown up in the church family, knowing that his mother, who worked at the pub, was his mother. The whole town knew that was his mother, but he would only meet her maybe once a month under conditions. And he said to me on his deathbed that he thought it was really important that I find out where I came from. And that was around the same time as when they changed the law in New South Wales, and you could actually access your original birth certificate. It was also around the time I'd had my son. So those two important things, the death of my adopted father the birth of my natural son, both those things, and then the fact that you could actually go and get that birth certificate, all came together at the same time. And I applied for my birth certificate. Now, this is all told in the book, I should say. So I get my mother's name on my birth certificate, her first name and her last name. I get the information about the town where she was born, which is in a different state to where I grew up. There's no father's name. So straight away, back in 1993, I go to the post office and start, like, same as then, there was no Google. So I'm going through all the post books with all the telephone numbers of all the people who lived in Victoria to try and find this person, my mother. Long story cut short, after many telephone calls, I happened to get onto, so she'd married again. Somehow I got onto her brother-in-law. Then I got onto her sister, who said to me, yes, I remember my sister having a baby, but she will not be happy about hearing from you. But here's the telephone number. So my adopted mother and I, sitting in the lounge room, and I rang my natural mother. And she obviously didn't want to hear from me. I'd gone about it all the wrong way. She screamed at me down the phone, wanted to know if I wanted money, wanted to know what it is I wanted. And all I really wanted was to know my story. That's what I really wanted to know. My adopted mother got on the phone, and all she could keep saying, I remember, and I talk about this in the book, all she could keep saying was, Susan is a good girl, she's a good girl. She just wants to know how she came into the world. So after that phone call, which I made, it was the wrong thing to do, but I made it in naivety. I really did believe that I would ring her and she would go, oh, wow, you know, my long lost daughter, I've been thinking about you every single day since the day I had to give you up, because that's the story you read about all the time. But that's not what happened. And the minute I got off the phone, that's when my anger kicked in, and we're talking 1993. So I wrote her a letter demanding to know who my father was, what the story was, why they'd given me up, were there any diseases in the family, what was my heritage, my ethnic background, my religion. That I wanted to know all that. And she wrote me a letter back, and the letter told this fantastic story about an Irishman that she'd met in Melbourne in 1960. I was born in 61. He'd been a police officer in Melbourne, and they had run away together and were travelling around Australia raising money for the IRA. And the police were after them, and they stopped and had me in Newcastle and then kept going around Australia for another year, ended up in Perth, which is the other side of the country. Then one day the police came knocking at the door where they were living, and she said in the letter, that's when I legged it and went back to Melbourne. So reading, and in the letter it was like his name was a common Irish name. So there was this whole tone about her. And I'm not going to pretend to be kind. She had a tone that was very superior, and, you know, quoting her, having me was the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She was really blunt, and there was no sensitivity towards me or the way I felt or the situation. Anyway, his name, she said, was some common Irish name, and she gave a few examples. And of course, straight away, like Anne, I wanted to know who my father was. So I'm back at the post office, checking names. Nothing came up. Couldn't find these names. And at that time I decided this was just some fanciful story that she'd made up, because who would believe it? Then I couldn't find his name. I couldn't find anything that corroborated her story. So I gave up, because her on the phone and in the letter, she threatened that if I contacted her again, she would get the police onto me. And so I gave up. I gave up in 1994 or whatever it was by then, thinking that I had a little bit, I'd just have to be satisfied with what I had. 20 years later, 2011, and my best friend died from cancer. And we were 50. And it's really interesting because she'd also been adopted. And there was a veto on her adoption papers. There was no veto on mine because my mother had gone to live somewhere else and had not put a veto on, which is why legally at the time, really, I was fine to contact her. But my best friend could not find any information about her mother or father. And she, she died from bowel cancer. And I can't help thinking that if maybe she'd had medical information about her background, because it came as a shock to all of us. There was no warning that she was getting bowel cancer. She died, and I realised, that was, I'd say she died, but it was one of the worst things that had ever happened to me, because we'd been friends since we were 10 years old. And sorry, been a while since I cried telling the story. So she died, and I realised that if I didn't have one more go and find out more about my story, that my parents, my genetic parents, they might die also. So believe it or not, I got in the car. This is terrible. And I drove all the way to where she lived, which was a different state. And I rocked up on the doorstep and confronted her, which is everything you're not supposed to do. And we had another screaming match on the doorstep, and she told me the name of my father. And didn't I know who he was? Everybody knew who he was. He was famous. So I go straight back to the motel, Google away. Who is this man? He's a famous AFL player from Victoria. He's half Chinese. Or, for 3 weeks, I'm looking at myself in the mirror, trying to find Chinese features on my face. Then I go to the hometown of my natural mother, where, because I'm sure Anne is the same, your detective skills just go through the roof. I find that this AFL player and my mother were in this town at the same time. So that is beginning to legitimise what I think is my story. I go down, I meet some of the older people in the town. They remember the story of the AFL player. They remember the story of my mother getting pregnant and having to move away to have the baby. It's me. I found the town from where my mother came from. I found my father, who is dead, by the way. The AFL player is dead. Then the old lady I'm talking to says to me, I've got that letter that you sent me about 2 years ago. And I said, what letter? And she said, your name's Susan. You sent me a letter 2 years ago about being adopted and wanting information about your mother. I said, I've never sent you a letter. I didn't even know you before tonight. And she wanders away and comes back with this letter from Susan. You can imagine, I'm sitting in the lounge room. Like, it was just the most surreal time of my whole life. Susan was born in 1959 to my mother. My name is Susan, and I was born in 1961 to my mother. So my mother had had a daughter before me, named the girl Susan, and adopted Susan out in a different state. So I have a half sister called Susan, there's me. And that man who I thought was my father was actually Susan's father. Melbourne Susan, I call her. I go and meet Melbourne Susan, who is not keen to know much information. And our relationship didn't go any further than that coffee. I asked her if she wanted to know who her father was, because I had all that information. She did not want to know who he was. So we parted ways, and it was amicable. We just felt different about the adoption. We didn't feel different about our mother. Okay, so then what happened? It's a very long and involved story. Then I decided, my husband decided, that we should look back to the original letter, which by now is nearly 20 years old. I read back through the letter. My husband did a bit of research to discover that the Victorian Police Association would give you information about their police officers if 40 years had passed since they'd left the police service. And a few quick numbers, I figured out that my father would have, 40 years would have passed. I wrote to the Victorian Police Association, and they sent me back after all the time of having so much trouble trying to get records and trying to find out who I was, and people blocking me at every path, to discover, open an envelope, there's a picture of my father with all the information about how tall he was. His name was exactly the name that she gave me in the letter. He left the police force in 1959, which would have worked. He looked just like me. My husband and I go to Perth, meet him. He's a little Irishman who is incredibly inappropriate. At no time did he actually say he was my father. And I said, but I was born in 61. You've admitted that you were in Newcastle with my mother in 61, that you were travelling around Australia. How could you not see that she was pregnant? And he said, well, I thought she'd got it seen to. I thought she'd got it seen to. Obviously, she did not get it seen to, and I was the product of their relationship. So we left Perth, and I now had met both my mother and my father. Knew I'd been born when they were on the run, dropped off in Newcastle, 3 weeks in the hospital, given to my mother and my father. That's basically the story that I tell in the book, with some additions towards the end about finding love, which was so important to me, and how that story ended, and how I guess I came full circle in discovering who I was, that I was lovable. I'm still angry about the fact that it's so difficult to get the information you need. I'm on a few adoption sites, and there are so many people who were adopted in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s who still cannot access their information. DNA's investigations is making it easier. But even the 3 weeks when I was in the hospital, I knew what hospital it was, and I want to know how I was treated in that 3 weeks. How did the nurses treat me? Was I in the nursery with all the other babies, or was I in a different nursery? You know, was I picked up? Was I sung to? Did they care for me? And even getting that information is such a rigmarole. I just can't, you know, I have to do this, and it costs this much money to get that information, to find out, or not, because they might not necessarily have that information. I feel like I've sat here for 20 minutes and whinged terribly about my situation and about my interrupted childhood, my interrupted identity, because I am still angry about it. Even though I know, and knowledge is power, and I do believe that knowing how I was born and how I was brought into the world and how I survived and how I kept powering through until they finally gave me the information it was my right to know. That's actually something that's formed who I am. So at 60, nearly 61, I feel that going through all that actually proved to me that I'm somebody that I should be proud of, and that I'm not my awful mother and I'm not my scheming father. I'm actually the person that survived all that and survived many other things in my life like we all do. And that's who I am. My identity grew out of that. What else do I want to say? I think that's pretty much it. The publication journey was easy. Like Anne, I was determined not to be a victim. I remember saying to the publisher, I just don't want to be painted as a victim. Please don't paint me as a victim in any of the publicity. Over time, 2 years since the book has been published, some things I feel different about, but like I said earlier, I wouldn't have changed the way I wrote it or changed what I said, because it's my story and I wrote it to write myself into the world. You don't hold my story, I do. And this is my story. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Susan. How are you feeling now? Because I know that was distressing earlier for you when you were thinking about your friend.
I think it's really interesting that I got upset about my friend, as opposed to the adoption or anything else. But that's because my friend's daughter is getting married this year. So it's going to be an emotional year. Yeah.
Yes.
But I'm fine. Honestly, I'm fine. Thank you for asking.
Okay, fantastic. What a story. The two Susans always gets me.
It still gets me. But we look remarkably similar. I've never seen anyone who looks more like me than her.
You look at all like your mother or father?
Very much like my father. There's a photograph of the two of us sitting in the pub in Perth, and we look very similar. My mother, not so much, but my sister, the other Susan, we were sitting in the tea shop in Melbourne, and the waitress came up and said, oh, isn't it nice two sisters having afternoon tea together? So we looked so alike that someone else could tell, which meant a lot to me.
Yeah, amazing. Would anybody like to have a break? Feel free to have a break or get a cup of tea, and we'll just continue the conversation with whoever doesn't want to feel the need to have a break at all.
I am going to nip to get a cuppa actually, but I just wanted to show this book to Anne and Susan. Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal? Have you read it?
No. Well, I love Jeanette Widdowson. She's wonderful.
Absolutely fantastic. And I was trying to find there's a quote about how she comes into the world. I can't find it, but it's lovely. And of course she was adopted as well, and it's about writing, but it's also about many other things. And what you were just saying at the end, Susan, about it being your story. I'll see if I can find it. Well, I'm just going to grab a drink and I'll be straight back, but carry on chatting. That was wonderful listening to both Anne and Susan.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I expect people have got some questions, so I'll be right back.
I'm having a menopausal moment.
Does anybody want to jump in with a question? I've got lots of questions, but I should just leave space for other people, I think. So does anybody want to jump in with a question?
It's Chris here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can Chris.
I just was going to make a comment just about Susan's book. I've just recently read it, and I've just enjoyed it so much. I mean, I don't know if enjoy is the right word for all of it, but really, I just think you did it so well, and to combine this other story about love in with it, that it all blended so well. And it was like reading in the end, a bit of a mystery novel, your search. And I couldn't wait. I read it really quickly because I couldn't really put it down. And that's very rare, to be able to read a memoir and have that same feeling. So I just really wanted to say how much I got from it and how impressed I was with the way you wrote it. I just thought it was really brilliantly done. So thank you.
I really appreciate that. Thank you very, very much.
I had a similar feeling, Chris, that I was excited to get back to it and to get on with it. And that's not always the case with memoir, especially not with difficult stories as well. But yeah, and I was telling my partner about it, and it was really odd that I was doing that on the way through. So it was that combination of memoir but mystery story, and I wanted to get back to find out what happened next.
Yeah,
which was wonderful.
And it kind of broke it up too, because it was very complex, you know, all the two Susans and you know, your mother and the lives and all this sort of thing. So it sort of was good having that mystery side of it as well, you know, breaking it up, or it just made it, yeah, just really interesting.
That was one of the hardest things to do, was to structure it, because there were so many reflections. There were so many looking in the mirror moments that it was confusing. It's confusing still for me. I have to write down the sequence of events because one thing literally led to another. And if I leave one bit out, then the story doesn't make sense. But it's so complicated and it took such a long time. So structuring the story was the thing that I found the hardest. But the same as Anne, in the end, I sectioned mine into 3 sections. It was the simplest way to structure a very complex story.
That's been on my mind with both Anne and, you know, something that's in common with this story, even though it's not exactly the same, is that is the lack of desire on your mother's part to own that relationship, your birth mother's part. So it was different for you, Anne. She didn't yell down the line or close the door on your face, but she was distant still. And so I was wondering what it was like for you both, because that's similar, that kind of another rejection, I suppose, what that was like as an adult.
Yeah, I think for me, my mum must have had a shock coming to the UK as a young, you know, youngster, and with no sort of support around her. And she was faced with a very, very different culture of being here. And I have no doubt that she was probably very frightened. And, you know, when I've spoken or she's tried to speak to me about things about her life, she was faced with all these white officials telling her what she needed to do. She bolted. It's as simple as that. She did not want to be found. She wasn't emotionally ready to take on the fact that not only she had me and then my brother 15 months later. My brother's circumstances in his early days were exactly the same. So even then, after having my brother, she still bolted. So she wasn't ready to take that on. Whatever had happened that had caused our birth, we still don't know. So I suspect that maturity just wasn't there at that time. And then when you then start to change your identity, as my mother did, she changed her name. I think we may be on the 4th name now, completely change of name. And for us to still have found her is quite a miracle. And today she still does not refer to us as her children. We just happen to be people that may come and see her from time to time. So it is very difficult, but I have to acknowledge and respect that.
Thank you.
And I cop a lot of flack have copped a lot of flack from people on adoption Facebook sites about what I did and how I confronted my mother. And But I still don't understand why it is that I have to be the one to take the step back if I'm not getting the information that is my right to have. And she's very distant. I've stayed away since 2012. I've not contacted her since because I now have the information I need. She has 2 grown-up daughters, which I think is another example of that reflection. There's Susan and I, and there's the 2 daughters that she has with her husband now. I would never approach them. I'm sure they don't realise that I'm alive, but that wasn't part of what I wanted. I just wanted her to tell me who I was and where I came from. That's all I wanted. And if perhaps things had been done a little bit differently from the beginning, it wouldn't have been such a fraught experience for both of us. I'm sure now that whole, that whole story, that whole fairy tale that your mother gave you up and she was thinking about you every day, and, the minute you turned 18, she went looking for you. That whole stereotype is not part of either of our stories. And
I would agree with you with that, because like I say, you fantasize about what your mother figure will actually be and where she'll take you. And when then you're really confronted with the truth that is not actually going to happen, it does make you very cross and angry, because all you want to know is how I became to be in this world, and also a little bit about what's going on in her world as well.
Yeah, you don't necessarily want the full-blown relationship with them.
No,
you
not
just
necessarily.
Want to know. No.
Yes.
I was really lucky at around about 2012. I stumbled across a memoir written by an Australian academic who knew my mother as she was growing up, which is amazing. Yeah. And he's quite a famous person in Australian literary circles. And there's this amazing description of the girls next door, which were my mother and her sister. And there's this story about my mother sitting under the tree reading a book, and how she went to England and she was into politics. And honestly, I could have been reading a story about myself. Yes. So I didn't get that relationship or that connection from her. I got my connection from reading that page in that book. And that was the first time I ever felt, and have felt since, a connection between us, which I'm really grateful for. I'm really grateful for that. She couldn't give me that, but I did find that.
Thank you, Susan. I've found the paragraph, a couple of paragraphs from Jeanette Winterson's book, and I think this applies. She was adopted, so she's talking about adopted people, but I think it also applies to people that don't know who their parents were. So she's telling us about when she was speaking to her mother on the phone, and it was always that, the devil had led them to the wrong crib. This is what the mother said to Jeanette. And she says, the mother says to her, well, if it's a story, why is the main character called Jeanette? Well, there we are. Why? So then she said, this is what she says: I can't remember a time when I wasn't setting my story against hers. It was my survival from the very beginning. Adopted children are self-invented because we have to be. There is an absence, a void, a question mark at the very beginning of our lives. A crucial part of our story is gone, and violently, like a bomb in the womb. The baby explodes into an unknown world that is only knowable through some kind of a story. Of course, that is how we all live. It's the narrative of our lives. But adoption drops you into the story after it has started. It's like reading a book with the first few pages missing. It's like arriving after curtain up. The feeling that something is missing never, ever leaves you, and it can't and it shouldn't, because something is missing. That isn't of its nature negative. The missing part, the missing past, can be an opening, not a void. It can be an entry as well as an exit. It is the fossil record, the imprint of another life. And although you can never have that life, your fingers trace the space where it might have been, and your fingers learn a kind of braille. There are markings here, raised like welts. Read them, read the hurt, rewrite them, rewrite the hurt. I've never forgotten
That's
that.
amazing. That's
Yeah.
amazing. I've never heard anything truer. That's amazing. Thank you for telling me that. It's amazing. Yeah. Wow.
She's a great writer, isn't she? Actually, Anne, I don't know if anybody's already asked you this, but I wondered about your foster sister, if you stayed in touch.
Unfortunately, she actually left at the age of 5 when I was with my foster parents. And, you know, even with modern tracing, I have tried to see if I could find her, but we would only have probably her original name, if that was her original name. And so I've not had any contact with her. When after my foster sister left, we had another 2 other foster children come into the family, believe it or not. And I still have, well, up till 2 years ago, I did have sporadic contact with them. Unfortunately, no, the foster brother then, he died. All 3 of us were then placed in the children's home. And up till 5 years ago, I was still having letter contact with my foster mum.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and she's died. So that's been quite beneficial. But interesting, like how you're being directed. When my mum came on the scene, I was also still receiving letters from my foster mum, who was in Adelaide at the time. And both of them were telling me, it's almost like a double whammy, both of them were telling me how I should be living my life. Directing me as to make sure you do this, both of them, and make sure you do that, expectations of you doing this, and I've got expectations. So I had both of them in front of me, and I was thinking, but you're in Adelaide and you're somewhere where I can't. My own mum is somewhere in London, and neither of you have come to actually help me with how you're directing I should live my life.
Amazing. We do actually have a question in the chat, so I'll just read that out. Thank you both so much for sharing your stories. It has been really powerful hearing you both speak. I was wondering that when you started exploring your story and putting the pieces together, did you always know you wanted to put it into a book and publish it, or did that come in the process? So Anne, if you answer that first, and then Susan.
I'd always had it in my mind that I would write my story. The idea wasn't necessarily that I would be published. It was just to make sure I wrote my story. I think it's because by the time I put it together, I got this encouragement by my family to see if it could be published. I mean, that wasn't the intention. The intention was just to write my memoir for myself and hopefully for my son. And my brother was obviously interested with his story. So it wasn't with the intention I want to be published, no.
Thank you, Anne. And there's questions from Melissa. Susan.
When I started in 2012, after I'd had the doorstep with my mother, before I'd met my father. I probably was thinking of publication, but in a very hazy way. And then when the tragedy struck, and I won't say what it was, when that happened in 2015, writing my story and having that goal of getting it published is literally what got me up every single morning for the next 3 years. And for me then, publication, I was going to publish her, I don't know what I was going to do, but I wasn't going to be very happy. I was, that got me up every single morning. It gave meaning to my life, and it got me through some very, very difficult years.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Susan, there's some things that you mention like why I love to read, which really resounded with me. Didn't belong anywhere. Books were always a better place for me. I wasn't adopted, but that was really good. And then later on, it's in the same chapter, the where you actually move in with Wayne, or you're talking about moving into Wayne. He said, something I desperately wanted could only be achieved if I understood every aspect of what had gone before. That is such a powerful sentence, because even at my age, I can't say that I understood every aspect of my life. And I think you've really got the understanding of what you have written and to your experiences, and I think that it will be certainly a lot of things will ring a bell with other people when they read it. I just frankly I can't put the book down. It's just so gripping.
Thank you so much. I realized when you were talking that you were quoting from the book. that's a very strange thing. Thank you so much for what you said. I don't know, sometimes I think I have my mouth too open and I say too much. But one thing about writing the book is that I'm not afraid to, and I guess because I'm older now, and before I wrote the book and before all the things happened from 2012 to 2020, I was a lot meeker and a lot more of a people pleaser, which is what adoptive people are. If you don't please your parents, if you don't please the people around you, they might send you back from where you came. And I know that about myself, but these days I'm not such a people pleaser. But I still really like it when people say they like the book. So thanks, Jackie. Thank you.
Well, that's more about people pleasing you than the other way around, isn't it, Susan?
Yeah, I guess it is. It's an interesting experience, that.
Fantastic. And I wanted to ask you about, in your professional life, I've had a number of conversations with people, particularly recently with a social worker who was working in the child protection space, as you have, and who didn't feel comfortable saying they had been in care themselves. And I was wondering whether that was true for you too, or whether you always talked about your care experience.
It's never something that I've hidden. I've been very open and upfront, and a lot of situations that I've been in working within social work, social care, I've been able to relate to and said, I understand actually what's happening here. I don't necessarily, perhaps the people that I was supporting would I have said, but more than likely with colleagues, other professionals have said that I was brought up in care. It's never something that I've hidden. And as you can imagine, I chatter away. So it would have come up in conversations on many occasions in my professional life. And indeed, in the police, when I was in the police force for 3 years, it was very obvious and evident that I'd rather be helping people than punishing people. And I was often told that I was too kind, too soft, and I was almost social working people in the police then. So no, it's just shaped just the way I am, and because I've been very up and open about being brought up in care.
And there weren't adverse reactions? People didn't treat you differently or expect?
No, I think they were surprised. A lot of people have been surprised because, as we talked earlier, we're not necessarily victims, we're not gangsters, you know, we're not crime, you know, I'm probably, it's those sorts of aspects where you have that label because you've been in care, you've obviously been in trouble. And I would say that the majority of the youngsters that I was with in care, they had their own problems and difficulties and needs, but it wasn't because they'd been in trouble, it's because what had actually been done to them. That's why they're in the care system. Yeah. So yes, it's not got me into any difficulties at all.
Well, that's very good to hear.
Yeah, it's very good to hear. Can I just add here that, and it's also, Anne, very, very unusual, because I've spoken to many, many people that are working in social care, and you know, a lot of them say, I never ever mentioned the fact that I was in care. I think that probably says something about your belief in yourself, actually.
Yes.
Because, yeah, I think if you're less confident, and yeah, if you're less confident, it can lead to difficulties in that you think.
I think it's having that understanding, yes, because a lot of the work that I've done is within residential sort of settings and supported people, managers, etc., within residential settings, and it's looking at those types of institutionalized behavior practices that take place where you're trying to take that away, where you're actually saying to people, you treat them as an individual and not the lock, stock, barrel that I had with having to live with 23 other people. And it was the convenience of the staff that you did things this way, rather than actually looking at me as a youngster, age 9, who was having difficulties. But I was the problem. It wasn't the institution wasn't the problem. I was the problem. So that's why I always speak up when I've worked, to say, actually, you're thinking I've got to run things this way to suit the institution rather than the individual.
Lovely, lovely to hear. And I know we're going to be finishing very, very soon, but I just wanted to ask both Anne and Susan if you have gone down the DNA route.
Yes.
You have?
I have, yes. I did that at a very, very early stage.
Okay.
Nothing's come of it as such. Okay. Some interesting encounters, but certainly nothing. I've not still been able to find my father, but I have been able to establish that I am Nigerian birth. My father's Nigerian, but more specifically, I'm from Benin, just on the edge of Nigeria, and I had no idea that that was the case. And for some very strange reason, which will make me smile, I have 1% Irish somewhere along the way. So I have no idea.
You get everywhere.
Yes, exactly. But the importance is knowing that I am Nigerian, and I so relate to that now.
Yeah. That's lovely.
And that's a joy. That has actually been a joy to my life now. It's added to everything.
And Susan?
We know you've got more than 1% Irish.
Yeah. I haven't gone down the DNA because after I found out definitively who my parents were, I went back through birth deaths and marriages and got all the birth certificates all the way back to about my mother on my great-great-great-great-grandmother on my IRA father's side came across on the ship, on a convict ship from Ireland, and I did the whole thing with my mother, and her ancestors came from Sweden in about 1845. Wow. On a ship to Australia. So I figure I'm Irish and Swedish. And I'm really terrified to do the DNA thing in case, like I can just imagine, there's been so many twists and turns in the story. What if I did the DNA and it turned out the people who I believed to be my parents were not, or there's some other thing I discover? For me now, I'm just settled with what I know. Okay. And I'll just keep that. I'll just keep that.
Interesting. I actually did a DNA, and after 61 years, I'm nearly 64 now, I discovered who my father was, and he wasn't the person that I'd been told that he was, which was, well, let's just say that all my fantasies that I'd had of this, oh God, what's that famous black and white movie star? The image I had of my father, because I'd been shown a photo and told that's your father, the image that I had, I then related to different film stars over the years. Gregory Peck, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, Gregory Peck. And my real father, I don't know, maybe he looks a little bit like him. But yeah, that was shocking and interesting, and yeah, after all those years. And it's like,
it's a risk. It is a risk to do
Yeah.
it, isn't it? Because those images, expectations could easily be blown very quickly, and then you've got to deal with the fallout from that.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous route at times, but I just felt I've got nothing to lose. If my mum is not necessarily in my life, but I do want to know if there's other family members other than my brother. So I was just prepared to go straight in there.
Just on that same subject, it might be worth you speaking to somebody at the Care Leavers Association about the fact that the social services wherever you were based know who your father was, and they haven't given you that information. Because,
well, he's alleged to be my father.
Okay.
Yeah.
But alleged still gives you something to go on. And I think it's very, very unfair that there are strangers that have that information, but you don't. So it might be worth speaking to somebody at the Care Leavers Association about that, if you wanted to.
I'll come back to you on that, Rosie.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. All right.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
So it sounds, Susan, as if the mother's rights still prevail, according to your experience. You talked about that earlier, right at the beginning, in terms of that you had no rights as a child to know anything about your family, and that's amazingly like the story that Rosie was telling of that child born and placed in the foundling hospital, knew nothing. Do you think it's still like that? Because I did notice recently that I think the Victorian government here is doing redress for forced adoptions, and there was redress for the mothers, but nothing for the children. So I was just wondering how you were feeling about that.
I think, so these days adoption is done very differently, thank goodness. But, you know, whenever I do a talk or I hop onto the websites, so many women or men of my age group still do not have access, have no idea how to get the access. And even as Anne was talking, and then Rosie said it, there are strangers that know your story when you are not allowed to know that story. You know, when is that okay? Like, why is that okay? Why does it cost money? You know, no matter what they're doing in Victoria, I bet it costs money, you know, to get your records or to do whatever it is you need to do to get your story. That should be something that, you know I'm going over old ground, but it still makes me angry. And I think there's many people my age who will never know. Anne might never know who her father was because records are lost, or, you know, and I don't know what you do about that, really, but it's still very, very, very angry making.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, that's how I feel about it.
No, I think that sounds very reasonable to feel angry about it, actually.
And I know who my parents were now. And I'm not too worried about DNA because I looked at my father and I could tell, looking at him that he and I were related. I looked at the other Susan. You know, we could have been twins. I'm not really concerned about them not being who I think they are.
Mm.
I just wish it hadn't been so damn hard to get that information. And I created so much stress for her, and her, in inverted commas. I bet she's sitting where she lives thinking every day, is that crazy girl going to be knocking on my door again? You know, that's probably what she's thinking. And I did that to her. But I did it because I was driven. There was no other way to get that information. I didn't believe the letter was true. I thought if I face her, she'll be forced to tell. And she was forced to tell. It just wasn't the right father. So yeah, I think for everybody involved, my situation and millions of others, it's just gut-wrenching.
Thank you, Susan. Margaret Forster wrote a book, I don't know whether you've read it, it's called Shadow Baby. And it's about two people that didn't know their mothers, or presumably their father as well. And it's set in different, I think one's set in 1800 and something, and one is set in 1980 or something like that. And the shadow, you were just saying about your mother and how she might feel, and the shadow is the shadow at the door. And it's a really interesting read, actually.
I think it's interesting, yeah, how our conversation is always around the mother. And when I talked early on in my talk, I'd said that friends and family critique my book. And one of my family members actually came back to me and says, "You've not actually mentioned anywhere about your father. How comes he gets off scot-free in your book?" And that's where we're going, isn't it? That responsibility, the father figure is nowhere to be seen in a lot of this type of writing that we're doing, and it's always based on the mother. So maybe we need to think about that at some stage. Yes.
I also think that the whole nurture-nature debate and what you take from a mother or a father that might not necessarily be in your life, and then what you take from the people who raise you. So the people who raised me were very different to me. You know, they love sport. I hate sport, but it was a big thing in our house. You know, it was like a culture in our house. I couldn't stand sport. I always felt from a really young age that I wasn't necessarily I didn't belong. You know, there's no other way of saying it. When I read about my mother and who she was and what she was like, I could see myself. It was a different culture. And yet the parents that I ended up with did a pretty good job. And I think about my mother, if I'd stayed with her, I would have been travelling around Australia, raising money. Here's the little Irish baby, raise money for the IRA. It would have been a really, really, really different childhood.
And yes, because you talk about nurture nature, when you think that as a lot of children being brought up in large institutions, that is actually never going to happen. So, you know, thinking about how can we hug? Do we love? Do we share? It's not like that. It is about survival, because you just step back. Because if you actually get to like or know, say, a particular care staff member, they could be gone in 2 months, they could be gone in 6 months, and you'll never see them again. So you don't actually wish to invest too much. You do have to step back. And that does follow you through into your adulthood, as to how to deal with these adults that are around you, because you've not actually been allowed to from such an early age.
So what is there in place of, so we both have nature, we both have things that were given to us from our natural parents. What is in place of the nurture? Is that just a blank?
I don't think I can answer that. I actually think that the way that I am, there's something in my DNA that's made me the way I am. And yes, events, whether it be to do location where you've lived, people fortunately that you've encountered along the way has been able to show you the way. And that's not always easy for people that haven't got that connection with a supporting adult. It's very, very difficult. If, like you say, you've had that supporting adults in your life, but if you've been brought up in an institution, you're not necessarily going to get that. You're going to get that somewhere else. Maybe that through school. I was very fortunate. I loved school, and I've got good friends' parents where you wish to be part of that. But I think that's very difficult to answer. I don't know where it comes from.
We've got some comments in the chats from people who've had to leave. Everybody's really enjoyed this morning. I know that Mike's got his hand up, so perhaps Mike, if we go to you and then we'll wind up after that, because I know you over in the UK want to get on with your day, and I might go and have dinner. So Mike, did you want to say something first?
I've enjoyed listening. I'm a foster carer in the UK, and I have grown up with both my parents, and I know my aunties, I know my uncles, and I know a long time ago I recognised that I had a gap in my dad's history where I didn't meet his parents, and it's a small gap compared to the lives that I'm listening to on this Zoom call. And I know that I made a conscious decision for my children to be constantly taking pictures and videos of family members, so that when they grow up they can see people in their family. And I don't know why I recognized that, but I just remember my mum's side, I met I met the grandparents, I met uncles, but my dad's side, hardly anybody. And I just wondered whether, because of how you've lived your life so far, whether there's anything you've made a conscious decision, other than writing the books, that you're documenting your surroundings, your family. So going forward from now, how your family knows what has happened and who is who, kind of vibe.
Very interesting question. Over to you, Anne and Susan.
Yeah, well, it works both in my home life and in my work life. And I've always emphasised in my work life, and certainly as a result of writing this book, how important it is for people to know where they're from, and to make sure, especially if I'm talking to a younger audience, if they've got a story to tell, to see if they can get somebody to write it down. If they've got belongings, so they've come from institutions, if they've got the belongings, but they're very transient, they're on the move, to see if they can leave some of their precious items with somebody that they could trust. So if they are on the move, they actually know they can go back to X to say they can pick up, whether it be a teddy bear, whether it be a card that was sent to them. That's part of their history, because it could easily be lost. And that's one of the things I felt, was there was so much that was easily lost in my childhood that I had no idea until I was I think it was in my 40s, where my foster mum actually sent me pictures from when I was a baby. I'd never seen these pictures at all. It was slightly overwhelming. So my family now know my history. We've always got pictures around. But in my work life, I would have encouraged, or did encourage, people to, if somebody was coming into a care home, for instance, to actually know a little bit more about them, because it could easily be lost.
And for me, I think the two main things, I made a conscious decision before my son was born to be very physically affectionate towards him, to tell him every day that I loved him, to be proud of him. I wanted to be overtly maternal with him and overtly proud of him, and for him to feel that he was really loved. And he's grown up now, he's 33 years old, but we have an amazing relationship. And that was really important to me. The other thing is I'm known as the woman who always takes too many photographs. People roll their eyes. Oh God, here she goes again, she's taking another photograph. And no one understands it. But after I lost somebody someone I loved very much, I look at those photographs now, and if I didn't have those photographs, I would forget places where we'd been and experiences that we'd had. Those photographs are so important to me, you know, to the fact that every single time I have to get a new phone, I just stress so much, and the whole story comes out to the man at the phone shop about how we have to keep these photos. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I think Mike's question is so relevant, is how do you do it? And it's difficult because there are gaps. I don't feel there's a gap anymore. My son, my stepson and my other family members actually know now about me, where before, if I hadn't had my file, there would still remain gaps. And a little bit, you don't have those, I've said in my talk, you don't have siblings necessarily, aunts, uncles, neighbours who used to call aunts and uncles to actually tell you how your early life was. You haven't got that memory to do that, because if you've been brought up in an institution, all those people have come and gone, and never to be seen again. So it is important along the way now to make sure that we do right for those youngsters who are having to live in care settings.
Well, that's fantastic. What a fantastic session it's been, a fantastic event. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much, Susan, for coming along and talking about your books. You've left a little bit of mystery there with yours, Susan, in case people don't know the story. So I do recommend, if you haven't read either of these books, please do go and do so, because they're different but equally fantastic. So thank you very much. Did you want to say anything in conclusion, Rosie?
No, just echoing what you've said, really. Thank you to Anne and Susan for coming along and speaking to us about their journeys. I think, Susan, I would say there is a huge love interest missing from your narrative.
Yeah.
So,
you've done that very well, Susan, in not approaching that. So yeah, clearly a good mystery storyteller. But thank you to everybody else too for coming along and joining in the conversation. That's been wonderful.
Thank you.
There's some comments in the chat. If anybody wants to have a quick look at those, and well, they're aimed at Anne and Susan, so yeah, you might want to have a quick look at those. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming along. It's been really interesting.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
I feel like
nice to meet you.
Yeah, our experiences are so different, but there's commonalities there.
Absolutely, yes.
And I haven't actually spoken to someone for a very long time who had their childhood interrupted. So it was lovely to meet you. Thank you. Yeah. And thank you to Rosie. And
thank you to both of you for inviting us.
Yeah.
It's been good.
And thanks, Rosie, for that interrupted childhood. I haven't actually heard that one used before, so that's fantastic. Yeah, I can add that to displaced and disrupted and interrupted. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. We'll say goodbye and let everybody know we've got another event in a few months. Planning, aren't we, Rosie?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for coming, and we'll see you all soon.